Hello, today is Saturday, August the 3rd, 1991. My name's Earl Chess, and I'm an alcoholic. I invite you to listen to the 8th annual 1991 Shenandoah Valley Roundup at Orkney Springs, Virginia. Now, thank you, and I hope you like this tape.
For our Al-Anon meeting, and I hope you're having a great time. It's a nice, cool night after a while. Bill has some announcements he would like to make.
I'm Bill, and I'm an alcoholic.
I'm a grateful member of Al-Anon. And we're going to have our door prizes now. And I've asked Alma if she would come up and help me.
Our person for today, let's all open with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. The Al-Anon Family Group is a fellowship of relatives and friends of alcoholics who share their experience, strength, and hope in order to solve their common problems. We believe alcoholism is a family illness and the changed attitudes can and aid recovery. Al-Anon is not allowed with any sex, denomination, political organizations, or institutions. Does not engage in any controversy, neither endorse nor opposes any cause. There are no dues for membership. Al-Anon is self-supporting through its own volunteer contributions. Al-Anon has but one purpose: to help families of alcoholism. We do this by practicing the 12 steps, by welcoming and giving comfort to families of alcoholism, and by giving an understanding and encouragement to the alcoholic. I have asked Helen H. from Harrisonburg to read the traditions.
I'm Helen Hook from the Harrisonburg Fellowship Al-Anon Group. The 12 traditions. These guidelines are the means of promoting harmony and growth in Al-Anon groups and in the worldwide fellowship of Al-Anon. Our group experiences suggest that our unity depends upon our adherence to these traditions. Number one, our common welfare should come first. Personal progress for the greatest number depends upon unity. Number two, our group purpose there. For our group purpose, there is but one authority: a loving God, as he may express himself to our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. Number three, the relatives of alcoholics, when gathered together for mutual aid, may call themselves an Al-Anon family group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation. The only requirement for membership is that there be a problem of alcoholism in a relative or a friend. 4. Each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting another group or Al-Anon or AA as a whole. Number 5. Each Al-Anon family group has but one purpose: to help families of alcoholics. We do this by practicing the 12 steps of AA ourselves, by encouraging and understanding our alcoholic relatives, and by welcoming and giving comfort to families of alcoholics. Number 6, our Al-Anon family groups ought never endorse, finance, or lend our name to any outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary spiritual aim. Although a separate entity, we should always cooperate with Alcoholics Anonymous. 7, each group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. Number 8, Al-Anon 12-step work should remain forever non-professional, but our special service centers may employ special workers. 9, our groups as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. 10, the Al-Anon family groups have no opinion on outside issues. Hence, our name ought never be drawn into public controversy. 11, Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, TV, and film. We need guard with special care the anonymity of all AA members. And number 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles above personalities.
I've asked Patty from Luray to read the 12 steps.
Hi, I'm Pat, and a member of Al-Anon. Hi, and I'm very grateful to be in this program. The 12 steps. Study of these steps is essential to progress in the Al-Anon program. The principles they embody are universal, applicable to everyone, whatever his personal creed. In Al-Anon, we strive for an ever deeper understanding of these steps and pray for the wisdom to apply them to our lives. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Thank you.
I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Carra. I met her in the cafeteria last night, although I have met her husband, as my husband collects tapes, and one of the Newmarket members went to Fourth State, D.C. a year or so ago and brought back a tape of him. So knowing my husband, he calls and gets in touch with him and has him to come to Newmarket one night. But at that time, his wife was unable to come with him. But I am glad that she was able to make it today and to talk with us. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Carra from Winchester, Stephen, Virginia.
Thank you, Nancy. My name's Carra, and I'm a grateful member of Al-Anon. I used to think I wanted to become a member of Alcoholics Anonymous because at one point Ed was really sick after he had come into this program, and I was afraid he was going to depart. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to me if I can't be part of that program too? So I'm really glad he did not depart this world at that stage in his life. There were times when I had wished he would depart this world, however. I've been asked to share my experience, strength, and hope with you, and this is a program of hope. It brought me a great deal of hope, and I know it continues to bring me hope and strength as I walk through this spiritual journey called life. There was an individual in AA when we first came into the program in Dayton, Ohio. His name was D-Car, and he was an old-timer in the program. And he used to say, it's okay to turn your head around and look back, just don't turn your feet around. So this morning, I'm going to turn my head around and look back. And I haven't done that in a long period of time. And I guess what came up for me as I did start looking back was an overwhelming sense of gratitude for where we are today as a family and where I am today as an individual. And I wouldn't be here as an individual if it hadn't been for the program of Al-Anon, and we wouldn't be here today together if it hadn't been for both the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Al-Anon. I grew up moving a great deal, and I was counting last night how many schools I had been in, and by the time I got to 8th grade, I had been in 6 schools. I'm the oldest of 6 children. My father was a Catholic who worked for a big organization, and that's the reason that we moved so much. My mother was a convert to Catholicism, and that means that she sat on the right-hand side of the Pope. If by any chance we did something wrong, we were taken to confession immediately, and that didn't mean that we waited until Saturday when the confessional was open. That meant that she went and banged on the door of the rectory and told the priest that he needed to get in the confessional because her daughter had committed a mortal sin. She didn't believe there were any such things as venial sins. And so I spent a great deal of time being locked in that little box in the church, having to tell the priest my mortal sins. And it really wasn't until I was a senior in college that someone said to me, "Carra, those aren't mortal sins. You are not going to go to hell." So I lived with a great deal of fear and a great deal of anxiety all through my early years. I always went to a Catholic school. There was no such thing as going to a public school. That was probably a mortal sin. As a result, I knew nothing about young men. These schools were almost always all-girls schools. By the time I got to high school, my parents had decided that I was such a problem that I had to board at school. And so on Monday morning, I would pack my suitcase and go off to school, and on Friday afternoon, I would pack my suitcase again and go home. And there was a direct telephone line between school and home. And on Monday morning, my mother would call Reverend Mother and say, "Carra has done this, this, and this over the weekend." So I would be punished at home for what I had done at home, and then I would be punished again at school. On Friday afternoon, Mother Burke would call my mother and say, "Carra has done this, this, and this at school," and I would be punished at home again for what I had already been punished at school. And so I spent a great deal of time in my bedroom. That was usually where I got put. And the one benefit of that was that I was able to read. I love to read, and thank goodness for my books and my dog, because I firmly believe that if it hadn't been for those 2 things, I would have just copped out on life. I can remember thinking about suicide or about leaving home and just never coming back, and the only reasons that I didn't do it were because if I left home, I wouldn't have enough money to feed my dog, and if I committed suicide, my dog would have to go on living in that family. It wasn't a happy life, but I didn't know that there was any other way of life. I thought that that was the way that people grew up. I knew I was treated differently than my younger sisters and my brother, but I didn't understand what it was about. And my main method of coping were 3 things. I used to either lie in order to try and get out of trouble. I used to either leave home in order to disappear or get away from it all, or I used to lash out in either verbal or physical ways. Those were my 3 coping skills. So you can understand, in a way, if those were your coping skills, what the heck your parents were trying to do with you. I mean, what did they do with this individual who lied, lashed out, or left? They had to do something, and that was what they did. I rolled into college a gorgeous 160 pounds. That was a lot of weight for me. I was shy. I was intellectually okay. I was competent in that area. Emotionally, I was in the 1st grade. I knew nothing about boys. I knew nothing about life in general. I had grown up in a very, very sheltered environment. I think the first time that I went to a movie, I was something like 13. It was a very unusual environment in which to grow up in. The first week in college, I met a young man. His name was Ed, and we started going out together. Well, that was unusual, too, because the only 2 young men that I had ever dated at all had entered the seminary. So I just figured going out with someone, well, Eventually, he'll also enter the seminary, and I'll just go on with my life. However, we went out all through the 4 years of college, and those were the happiest years of my growing up. I thoroughly enjoyed going out with him. I enjoyed what we did together. He was known on campus. He was a member of the newspaper staff. He did the broadcasting for the sports. He was sort of a big cheese. And so it was really fun to be part of that environment, to be in his shadow. And I was indeed a shadow. I was not an individual in my own right at all. When I graduated from college and I walked down from the podium with my diploma and I handed it to my father, his response was, "What the hell will you do with that?" I had graduated with a degree in philosophy, and he promptly sent me to secretarial school. So I started life in the Big Apple, and I hated it. I didn't like going to work. I didn't like anything that had to do with it. I just felt totally lost. I didn't like commuting from Greenwich, Connecticut into New York. I thought that was a waste of time. But I didn't know what to do with myself. I got another job closer to home that I liked a little bit better, but eventually Ed said, "Let's get married." Well, I decided that I had three choices. I could go on just sort of drifting through the world, not knowing where I was going or what I was doing. I could join the convent, which was an option that I wasn't looking forward to, or I could marry Ed. Well, of those three choices, marrying Ed looked like the best. So that's what I did. We got married. And I can remember the day that I walked down the aisle with him, thinking he is going to be my Rock of Gibraltar. I am never going to have to make another major decision in my life. This is the major decision that I will have to make in my life. And from now on, he will take care of me. Aha, I was wrong. I didn't know anything about the disease of alcoholism. I had no idea what I was getting into. He looked stable. He looked steady. He was a party boy. He liked to play a lot. And I enjoyed that part of him because my family had been so extremely serious that playing was something that I knew nothing about. But I had no idea what was ahead of us in any way, shape, or form. During the early years of our marriage, we were really relatively happy. We had our spats and our arguments and what have you, but nothing big came up. His manner of drinking was to drink everyone else under the table. I now know today that being able to hold liquor that way was a sign of the very, very early stages of this disease, that was not natural or normal. I knew nothing about that then. We had 4 children almost immediately, and within two of them were born with some serious physical problems, and within the first 8 years of our marriage, within the first 10 years of our marriage, there were 8 major operations. We couldn't have done that if we hadn't been friends and companions and worked it out together, and we did. We did that side by side with each other's cooperation, and we developed a really good relationship with each other. After about the first 10 years, though, things started to change. We bought a new home, and there was plenty of room for each of the children. They each had their own bedroom. I was happy. I thought that this was it. And I remember saying at that point, I want to be buried from this house. That was probably 6 houses ago. My wish didn't come true. That's when the insidious progressiveness of this disease started, and I had no idea what was going on. My introduction to the disease of alcoholism had been whispers about it at my parents' dining room table. When my parents didn't want us to know something, they would speak to each other in Spanish. We had lived in Spain for a while, and they had picked up that language. And I can remember them talking about my aunt occasionally and about her telephone calls in the middle of the night. And I remember my father saying, "Well, I'll just go into her apartment and I'll stop this." I knew somehow in one of my chambers of my mind that her conversations at night had something to do with drinking. He went into New York and spoke to my aunt, and the conversation stopped. Well, as a young child, I just assumed that if you told somebody to do something, then they did it. And so I connected his conversations with my aunt with her stopping drinking. I know today that she didn't stop drinking. She died of the disease of alcoholism. What she did was stop making telephone calls to our house. The other thing that happened that had to do with alcoholism was a cousin of my mother's who died of cirrhosis of the liver. And at the time of his death, I remember my mother and father saying to each other, he certainly deserved that. He was a rotten individual. He was rotten to his wife, he was rotten to his children, and he deserved to die. So those were my two contacts with the disease of alcoholism. One was death, rottenness, badness, weakness, and the other was, if you tell them to do something, they will stop. I was totally wrong. My contact with alcohol on a regular basis in my parents' home was that it was served at 6 o'clock in the evening as cocktails, and that it stopped at 7 o'clock. If either my mother or my father were going to have more than one drink, it was called a dividend. Cocktails were served on a silver tray. Cocktails were served with maraschino cherries and sliced lemons and olives, and if anybody even asked for a beer, it was always poured into a glass. And even that was looked upon with raised eyebrows, because that really wasn't cocktails. On the other hand, the first time that I walked into Ed's house was at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and on the table in the kitchen were 4 jelly glasses. Accompanying those 4 jelly glasses was a bottle on the kitchen table at 11 o'clock in the morning. Well, I knew that if I married this individual, that would never happen in our home. It did happen in our home. Those were my experiences with alcohol. And so as our value system started to change, we started to fight about it. Ed thought that it was more important to buy a great big gallon of scotch, and I thought it was more important to put shoes on our children's feet. And we started to fight about things like that. But I always was told that he knew best. I was always given some reason for the way we were doing it. I thought that it was more important to pay the electrical bill and the telephone bill, and he thought it was more important to join the country club. And yet there was always a reason why the thing that was more important had to come first. And I bought into those reasons. I thought, well, he's more intelligent than I am, so he must know what he's talking about. I never made the connection between what was going on with our arguments and our disagreements and a problem called alcoholism. It just never even entered my mind. We lived in a nice house, in a nice neighborhood. My husband had a nice job. He had a good paycheck, and I was not able to make the connection. I was ignorant, totally ignorant of this disease. However, things started to get worse. He started to come home later and later at night, and the fight started to get worse. And one evening he came home at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and he woke me up and he said, "How would you like to move to Ohio?" And my immediate response was, "I will go anywhere if it will get you away from those horrible friends and that bar car commute to New York City." I know now that it's called a geographical cure. At the time, I thought it was relief. I thought it was the answer. However, what happened was we moved to Ohio, and all the promises that he had made about coming home on time for dinner and going on picnics with the family were just promises. And you know, it's really interesting as I look back on it. Alcoholics, even as they drink, are more intelligent than we who are living with them, because they don't listen to our words. They listen to our actions. And we don't listen to their actions. We listen to their words. And we believe them. And we get our expectations up. And then we get our hopes shattered. And so what I've learned as I've lived this life is that it's much more important to speak in actions and to listen to actions. we moved to Ohio, and my children at that time were just approaching adolescence. Some were in high school, some were in their later years of grammar school. And they did not want to move, and they resisted it, and they resented it, and they were nasty, and they were belligerent, and they were ornery. But as children do, they adjusted. And sooner or later, they had friends, and they had activities, and there I was in an empty house with a husband who had broken his promises, and I looked around, and I was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. The initial embarrassment that this disease presents to us who are in the family disease had left me. I was no longer really embarrassed by what was going on, but I was angry. But I didn't know what I was angry at. I was blaming it on his friends. I was blaming it on his job. I was blaming it on the fact that we had 4 children so close together and that we had big expenses as a result of having those 4 children so close together. I didn't know what I was dealing with. And so I was reaching out and grasping at straws, and none of it was working. I was lying about what was going on in our home. I was lashing out at Ed. I was lashing out at the children. And I started to do the same things that I had done as a child. I was even leaving. I would get into the car with the threat that I'm never coming back, and I'd drive from Dayton, Ohio to the Ohio border on the way to Connecticut. That's a 5.5-hour drive. And I'd get to the border and suddenly say to myself, I can't go home. I can't tell my parents that I need to leave this SOB. They won't understand. Divorce is unheard of, or certainly was unheard of in those days in the Catholic Church. And I was too ashamed that I couldn't fix it. And so I'd turn around again and come back home. And then I'd unpack the suitcase and I'd throw the suitcase at Ed, and I'd tell him it was all his fault. And if he'd only shape up, I wouldn't have to make these trips. And if he'd do what I told him to do, everything in our life would be okay. As you know, that isn't the case. And things just got worse and worse and worse. And as this disease progressed, he lost his job. Of course he did. If you drink all day and you drink all night, that's going to be the natural outcome. But I blamed it on the people in New York, and I blamed it on the inability of the people in Ohio to understand my husband who had been brought up in New York, and I blamed it on everyone except the disease of alcoholism. I had my head buried in the sand. I was teaching school at that time, and someplace in my subconscious I must have known that there was something I needed to do for myself that would save my life. And when our children went into school, I had gone back to school and gotten my graduate degree so I could teach school. And that did indeed save my life during those days. Because when I left home in the morning at 7 o'clock until I came back home at 4:30, I had those hours in which I had to concentrate on my job. I was teaching in the inner city of Dayton, Ohio. And for those hours, I could not obsess about what was going on at home. And to me, that was absolutely an anchor that I needed. It was the only place where I had a sense of self-worth, where I knew that things were okay. Because as soon as I walked back into my house, nothing was okay. And basically nothing was okay because of the way that I overreacted to what was going on. Ed would walk in the door, and I would immediately give him a sniff-kiss test and a glance at the eyes. And based on how his eyes looked and on what he smelled like, I would go into orbit. If I thought he had had 5 drinks, my reaction was different than if I thought he had had 2 drinks. And frequently there would be kids in the playroom or in the family room, and I would push him upstairs and I would push him down on the bed, and I would beat the living hell out of him. If there were ever a shelter for battered men, he deserved to be there. And I don't know why he stayed in our home. I have no idea why he stayed there. One day one of the kids said, "Mom, we know there's something the matter with Dad, and we know he drinks. What the hell is the matter with you?" One day I decided that if I had a nervous breakdown on the stairs that he'd stop. And so I pulled a nervous breakdown on the stairs. and he walked right over me. I got crazier and crazier and crazier. One day he innocently went to the refrigerator to get out some ice cubes. Well, ice cubes set me into orbit, and I happened to have a frying pan in my hand at that time. And the frying pan landed on his ribs and then shattered on the floor. His ribs were broken, and I went on washing the dishes. I was crazy, but I didn't know I was crazy. My obsession was such that I could not see that my behavior was totally out of control. I remember I would stand in the shower and I would plan the sermons that I would deliver to him. And I would come out and deliver these sermons, and of course he would either be passed out or he would just turn on the television set and ignore them. And then I would take off my shoes and I would beat him up. One day in the shower I figured out that if I put a pillow on his head, then we could have the funeral, and I would be the perfect widow at the funeral. So I took a pillow and I put it on his head and I sat on it. And I sat on it and I watched my watch and I figured 10 minutes would be about right. So 10 minutes later I got up off the pillow and I moved the pillow and I put it back where it had been on the other side of the bed, and I smoothed that all out, and I went downstairs and I fixed dinner for the kids. About a half an hour later, he came downstairs. I thought, this isn't working. Something's wrong here. Okay, you can see I qualify for this program. However, I had no idea what was the cause. You know, you would think that an intelligent individual would put drinking plus drinking together and say, that's the cause of the problem. This individual was dyslexic when it came to alcoholism. I could not see that drinking was the problem. And one Easter weekend, my daughter was home from college, and I had fixed Easter dinner, and I called upstairs to Ed, who was in his usual prone position on the bed, and I said, Ed, would you like a drink before we have dinner? And my daughter looked at me and she said, Mom, why are you offering Daddy a drink? Don't you know he's an alcoholic? There was dead silence in our house. I had been asking people that same question for the past 2 years, and I had been getting responses like, from our Catholic priest, couldn't possibly be an alcoholic, he's too intelligent. From our neighbors who were intelligent, active members of our community, oh no, Carra, he's just got too many pressures. As soon as he gets a new job, he'll be okay. But somehow when my daughter said that to me, I knew that she had spoken the truth. I wasn't able to do anything about it immediately, but within the next month, I drove home to Connecticut, and this time I didn't stop at the Ohio border. I drove all the way through. I got there at about midnight on a Friday evening, and on Saturday morning I was banging on the door of the Catholic rectory to the priest whom both of us had trusted and loved a great deal. He greeted me at the door and he said, Carra, what is the matter with you? We went in and we sat down, and I said, Father O'Connor, Ed's an alcoholic. And he said, Carra, relax. Ed's been an alcoholic for at least 15 years. It's okay. Go to Al-Anon. I said, Father O'Connor, I've got to get a divorce. I can't live with an alcoholic. He said, Carra, relax. You've been living with an alcoholic for 15 years. Go to Al-Anon. I said, Father O'Connor, I can't have my children's father be an alcoholic. I've got to get them out of that situation. He said, Carra, relax. They've been living with alcoholism for 15 years. Go to Al-Anon. I still didn't have the courage to tell my parents what was going on in our home. But I did pack my suitcase and drive back to Ohio on Monday morning. And on Tuesday evening, I was at my first Al-Anon meeting in Centerville, Ohio. And although I've had Al-Anon groups since then that I consider my home group. That will always be the home group in my heart. When I went into that meeting, I was terrified. I thought it meant that they were going to put a notice on the front page of the New York Times, Ed is alcoholic. I didn't know what was going to happen. I expected to find people in little old babushkas who with tears streaming down their faces, and instead I walked into a room of laughing, smiling individuals. There were about 8 women in the room and about 3 men. Nobody saw me as I started to walk in the room, and I immediately turned around and ran out and got back in my car. And then I thought, Carra, this is crazy. Go back into that room. And I walked back in, and that time somebody noticed me, and a gentleman came over and shook my hand and said, welcome. For the next 6 months, I had lockjaw. I would sit in that room with my jaw clamped and my face in an absolute state of clay, practically, and I couldn't open my mouth. I couldn't say anything. I'd say, my name is Carra, pass. And that was about all I could get out. And I'd walk out of those meetings and I'd think, I don't understand. What are they talking about? But very, very, very gradually, things began to sink in. One of the first things I remember hearing was, take him off probation and give him a haven to come home to. Ed had been on probation for so many years that I didn't even know how to take him off probation. And so I had to start asking myself questions. How do I do that? How do I stop checking up on him? How do I give him a haven to come home to? How do I stop overreacting to his behavior? I started reading one day at a time. I started listening when people were talking about the tools of this program. I started hearing things like use the serenity prayer. I started hearing things like easy does it, let go and let God, first things first, keep it simple. And for me, I had to use visual aids in order to put those tools into practice. In order to practice easy does it, I had to pretend that I had super glue in my mouth. And I had to walk into the house, coming home from school, saying, easy does it. Don't open that mouth of yours. So instead of asking Ed how many resumes he had handed out that day, and how many drinks he had had, and where had he been, and who had he been with, I'd walk in the house and I'd try to keep quiet. And then very gradually I'd try to say things like, hello, how are you? I don't think I'd said hello, how are you for years. I tried to let go, and in order to let go, I had to visualize Ed in a pine box at the foot of our bed. Mind you, by this stage of the game, he almost was in a pine box. He was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I kept going to those meetings, and very, very gradually I began to feel as though I were a part of the group and as though I belonged there. And I started asking questions, and I started doing what I was told to do, get a sponsor. And I did that. I asked an individual to be my sponsor. She's dead today, but she saved my life. The first time I said to her, will you be my sponsor? She said, yes, but don't expect me to call you. You'll have to call me. So for a week I didn't use the phone. I thought, well, that's very rude of her. How come she's not going to call me? She's my sponsor. I picked up the phone and I think I dialed it 4 times before I finally let it ring. But she was there for me. She never gave me advice, but she always shared her experience, strength, and hope with me. She was always there to ask me if there was another way of looking at it, or if I couldn't do it differently. And when I'd say things like, I've got to get a divorce, I've got to get this man out of my house, she'd say, Carra, are you still angry? And I'd say, yes. And she'd say, I think it's better to wait. When you're not angry, you can make much better decisions. When you're angry, that anger clouds your decision. And so I'd have to wait. Because I respected her. She had been in this program at that time 14 years. She had come into the program before her husband had attained sobriety, and the two of them were now very active members of their own programs. So I knew that she was walking this walk, and I respected everything that she said to me. One of the reasons I'm standing here today is because one of the things that she said was, when you're asked in Al-Anon to do something, the answer is always yes. That answer hasn't been easy sometimes, but I know that it's important that I say yes. She would say things like, "How are you doing tonight?" And I said one time, "He's upstairs." She said, "Karen, I didn't ask you how he was. I said, how are you doing?" It was interesting to look back on that and to see where my focus was. My obsession with what Ed was doing and how he was doing was so great that I had no idea who I was or how I was doing. Shortly after Ed started going to AA, she said to me, "Are you going to invite him to the roundup?" We were having an Al-Anon roundup one evening in Dayton, and I said, "Oh, heavens no, he wouldn't want to go." And she said, "Carra, is your pride so great that you don't want to be seen with him?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, then I think you better ask him." At that point, he looked like a green cadaver. He shook all over. He looked like a derelict, and I didn't want to be seen with him. I did ask him. Fortunately, he said no. One of the first things I learned in this program were the 3 C's. You cannot control it, you cannot cure it, and you did not cause it. I didn't think I had caused this illness, but I sure thought I could control it, and I sure thought I could cure it. And I had worked awfully hard on both of those things. And in order to take the focus off of him and put it on myself, I had to keep him in that pine box. And when I would think, well, I need to tell Ed this, or I'd better tell him that, or maybe this will get him to his first AA meeting, I'd have to say to myself, no, he doesn't belong to you. He's his own person. And as far as you're concerned, he's in a pine box. One of the things that helped me the most was taking my 4-step to a priest, because I was still filled with anger and rage and resentment over what had happened in our lives. I didn't know how to be courteous. I didn't know how to be kind. And he said, "You know, Carra, God doesn't make junk. Ed is an individual in his own right, and he doesn't belong to you. And he'll get well in his own time, not in your time. And I want you to go home and tell him that you love him." Love him? I can't tell him that I love him. That would be dishonest. And he said, "Yes, you can. You can go home and tell him that as a human being, as a child of God, you love him." And I thought to myself, yes, I can do that. I would do that for any suffering person. And I do believe that this is an illness and that he is suffering. So as a suffering person, I was able to say, I love him. And I took him by the hand and I said, in a very, very, very quiet voice, "I love you." It's amazing what happened when I was able to do that. I was able to see him differently. I was able to see him as a suffering person instead of as an SOB who was ruining our family. I was able to see that I had a part in the ruination of our family and that there were a great many things that I had to do. At one point, he ended up in the hospital. He was dying from this disease. And I know now that it was my pride that prevented me from interceding before he got to that point. Because when he was in the DTs, I didn't know it was the DTs. I didn't know that when he said there's a spider on the wall, or there's a snake crawling on me, or get those kids out of this house when there weren't any kids in the house, that he was hallucinating. I couldn't tell my sponsor that, because I thought that she'd say, "Oh my God, he's really gone crazy. He's over the edge." And so I kept those things quiet. And I know today that I should have told her, and that we could have intervened before he got to that final stage. But I didn't tell anyone because I was too proud to share those horrible secrets that were going on in our home. In the first year of sobriety, I thought that was going to be wonderful. I thought that was going to be what I wanted. That we were going to drift off into the sunset on a pink cloud together, riding on 2 white horses. It didn't happen that way. All of a sudden, this individual was immersed in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was at a meeting. Noon and night. And my resentments went higher and higher and higher. He would come home from a meeting and he would say, my sponsor said, da 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 da. And I would think, man, I've been telling you that for 10 years. Fortunately, I had super glue. And fortunately, I had Easy Does It. And fortunately, I had Let Go and Let God and Live and Let Live. And I was able to keep quiet and to say, that's interesting. Or thank you for sharing. I didn't have to respond. I didn't have to overreact, which had been the way that I had always behaved. And it was a whole new way of behaving. One day he came downstairs and he had on his work clothes. And it was a Saturday morning, and the kids and I were deciding who was going to go to the grocery store, who was going to cut the lawn, who was going to clean the house, etc., etc. And my expectations went up into my heart, and my heart started beating rapidly, and I thought, he's joining the family, he's joining the family, hooray, hooray. And he said goodbye. You can imagine what happened to my feelings. They suddenly went down into my boots, and the rage suddenly went up into my head. And I almost said, you son of a bitch. But I didn't. I said, oh, really? And he said, yes, where's the vacuum cleaner? I said, what do you need the vacuum cleaner for? And he said, I'm going to vacuum the AA clubhouse. I didn't know he knew which end of a vacuum cleaner went in which end of the machine. I didn't know he knew how to use one. I didn't know any of those things. All I knew was, here he was, capable of vacuuming, capable of doing something, after 2 years of not being capable of doing anything, and he was going off to the Southside Club. Super glue saved my life again. The Serenity prayer saved my life. I didn't say anything, and thank God I didn't. I sure picked up the telephone and called my sponsor and expressed to her how angry I was. And she said, Carra, of what value will he ever be to you if he doesn't attain sobriety? And I was able to put it in a different perspective then. First things first. Sobriety was what had to come first. And if that were the way that he needed to attain sobriety, that was what he needed to do. Towards the end of the year, things started to come together. We took our first vacation together with trepidation, I'll grant you. I was scared to death. I didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know what to talk about with each other. We hadn't spoken in a really healthy, deep, concerned way for a long, long time. But we went to meetings on our vacation. We went to meetings on the Upper Peninsula. We went to AA meetings. I went to Al-Anon meetings. And we talked about what we heard at the meetings. And gradually we had a vocabulary in common, a vocabulary that we could share. I talked about learning how to accept what I had to accept. He talked about learning how to live sober. It was a whole new different way of communicating with each other. And it got better and better and better. Ooh, that bird. After about 2 years, I had to stop teaching school, and I thought my life was going to fall apart again. It didn't. I had open heart surgery, and I suddenly had to reevaluate my priorities. And I had to learn that where my priorities were was in my relationships with my family, my relationships with my friends, and my relationships with my higher power. I had to learn that being a human being didn't necessarily mean having labels, wife, mother, teacher. It had to do with how I worked my spiritual journey and how I used these tools. We had a phone call from our son when he was a sophomore in college, and it went something like this. "Hi, Mom, how are you?" He had started having problems when he was in high school, but the denial that we all suffer from when this disease creeps into our family crept into it again. Knowing the things I knew in Al-Anon and working a program did not prevent me from having the same reactions that I had to the disease when it was my husband's disease. He called home and he said, "Mom, where can I find an AA meeting?" He said, "I'd rather speak to Dad, but since I can't speak to Dad, I'll talk to you." And I said, "John, if you can't find a meeting by asking someone, either call the police station." He was in Laramie, Wyoming, where he went to college. "Either call the police station or look in the yellow pages of the phone book under the alcohol and drug abuse programs and call one of them. Or if Alcoholics Anonymous is in the phone book, call there." And he called back late that evening and talked to his dad, who had come home from New York by then, and he had been to his first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. My reactions were, "Oh my God, how could this happen to me? What did I do wrong? Why didn't I say his prayers with him better? Why didn't I bring him up better?" I knew intellectually about this disease. I knew that I hadn't caused it. And yet the reactions were that it must be my fault. That's human nature. That was my immediate response. I was embarrassed to tell anyone. And eventually I told my sponsor, and she said, "Carra, that's about you. That's not about keeping his anonymity. You need to start talking about what you're feeling and about what you need to do to get the focus back on you." I also remember when he came into the program being real clear that if this innocent child had developed this disease and was aware of it at the age of 19, Ed and every other alcoholic was also totally innocent. And I also knew that his coming into the program was partially because of the way that Ed and I had learned to live our programs. And so gradually, from a feeling of anxiety and anger and shame over the fact that it had happened to my son, I came to feel nothing but an overwhelming gratitude for the fact that he had identified his illness at such an early age, for the fact that we all had a program in common and that we could share together. We just came from a weekend with him and his wife in Denver. It was real special, and this program to me is real special. And today I'm extremely grateful to be here and to share with you. And I know that if I keep working this program on a daily basis, it will bring me nothing but continued joy and continued happiness. Thank you all very, very much.
On behalf of the Shenandoah Valley Roundup, we'd like to present you this little token for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much.
We have a nice way of closing. Let's all join hands and repeat the Lord's Prayer.
Freedom,